Does that mean that identity management and attribution is also going to be set at that Google
Mm.
Adobe level, or how does that work?
So that's where I have all the strong opinions. Because
Well, let's go.
so here's the problem: is we're still collecting the data client side, and whatever data we send in still has to have an identifier for the user. And right now, the way that you have client-side identifiers for users is cookies. Like nothing about that has changed just because server-side has entered the equation. Um, and yeah, as far as I can see, for the foreseeable future, the identity management side of things is still being handled client-side. So when server-side comes up as a kind of a response to the cookie apocalypse, or the getting around ITP or GDPR or any of that stuff, like it's just it it, it it's not part of the equation. Even it doesn't make a difference because we still have to know on the client side who the user is as they go from page to page. I will say, however, in my discussion with Lucas, and Simo, how it ended up coming in too, on Twitter the other day on this topic, where I was making this very point of, anything that you do to improve your identity management for server side, you can also do client side. It's the exact same thing. Um, Simo does have a template within Google Tag Manager server side that allows you to set cookies through a server through, I think it's Google Cloud,
Hmm.
um, so that will help with ITP. Now it's not built into the tool and it's not really kind of wrapped into the this is what server side is. To me, it was kind of a creative, nice workaround, sort of like I'm glad it exists. It's cool, it's usable, it's effective, but overall identity management is not yet folded into what server-side tag management does.
Do you see that something that gets pushed more towards, and I don't want to use the word client side, but the brand owner side rather than the data collection side? I almost kind of, I mean, it's completely different, but we've gone through this. Speaking of cookies, we've gone through this thing where it was set by a third party, then it was managed, like this first party was managed by the third party and set, and then we got to this point where it's like, well, you set these C names and maybe you set it on your side. Oops, I'm wondering if we get to a similar place with identity management where there's some kind of a trust handshake where they say, hey, you set all this stuff up on your server so we kind of get around all of these complications, and then we go from there.
I think ultimately it's going to come down to everybody setting their own IDs, at least as far as first party analytics goes. Obviously things that are trying to do retargeting across sites, it's going to get more complicated. But um, and both Google and Adobe have really upped their game as far as allowing companies to use their own IDs. Adobe just barely had their cross device, no, not cross device. They don't want it to be device. Uh, Device management ID, whatever the new ID thing is. And then with GA4, you also can send in your own user ID, and it's almost like GA4 is pushing for that rather than use the IDs that Google puts on there. So that gets you around a lot of the ITP limitations, that Apple makes it so that if you set a cookie by JavaScript or through a server, but a C-named server that your cookie only lasts 7 days, if instead, we just have our own identifier for users and we tell Adobe to use that instead, that gets us around it. Um,
Does that mean that I now have to invest in more software because most companies are not
mm,
qualified to set identifiers for anonymous traffic? So do I now have to go buy something? Do I have to go hire some experts to build identity management for me?
I don't think so. I think a lot of the time it might be that your developers already have like session IDs and stuff like that exist in CMS systems. Like a lot of that already exists. The problem historically has been tying it all together when it changes.
Mm-hmm.
That right now it's, if we have an ID for a user when they sign in, but it's different than when they're not signed in, they're going to look like two different users. Whereas in the future, or with the newer stuff, um, it can merge those profiles together and end up having 10 different IDs that all kind of melded together into one user, and that was the missing piece for a really long time that stopped us from using our own IDs.